For 40 years, they called him the Tree Man, not as a compliment, but when the fire came roaring down Devil's Canyon, every soul in Millfield understood what he'd been preparing for. The day Marcus Thorne bought the wasteland, half of Millfield thought he'd lost his mind. 300 acres of eroded hillside that hadn't grown anything but weeds and regret. Since the logging company stripped it bare in 1954, soil so depleted that even the hardiest prairie grass struggled to take root. The kind of land that real estate agents apologetically called a fixer-upper, and farmers avoided like a curse. But Marcus saw something different. Standing on the barren ridge overlooking the valley where Millfield nestled like a handful of wooden toys, he didn't see devastation. He saw possibility. He saw the ghost of what had been and the promise of what could be again. The neighbors thought he was crazy. The bank loan officer had required 3 separate appraisals before approving the purchase. Even his wife, Sarah, had asked gently if he was having some kind of midlife crisis. "It's just dirt, Marcus," she'd said, standing beside him on that first morning as he surveyed his new property. Expensive dirt. Marcus had smiled, kneeling to scoop up a handful of the sandy, lifeless soil. "Every forest starts with dirt, Sarah, and every forest starts with someone crazy enough to plant the first tree." That afternoon, he planted his first oak sapling. By the end of the week, he'd planted 50. By the end of the month, 300. The townspeople watched from their porches and shook their heads. Marcus Thorne, who'd run the most successful hardware store in 3 counties, had apparently decided to throw his money away on a pipe dream. "Trees don't grow on that ridge," old Tom Patterson declared at the weekly coffee gathering at May's Diner. "Been barren for 20 years, always will be. Soil's too thin," agreed Betty Morrison, who'd taught agricultural science at the high school for 30 years. Wrong drainage, wrong elevation, wrong everything. But Marcus kept planting every morning before opening the hardware store, every evening after closing, weekends from dawn to dusk. Oak trees, maple trees, pine trees, whatever species he could find that might have a fighting chance against the harsh conditions. Most of them died. The first year, Marcus lost 60% of his saplings to drought, wind, and soil that couldn't hold nutrients. The second year wasn't much better. People began calling it Thorne's Folly, a local joke that stung more than Marcus let on. But he kept planting, because Marcus Thorne knew something about Millfield that the others had forgotten. He remembered the fire of 1973. Most people didn't like to talk about it. The wildfire that had roared down from the mountains, consuming everything in its path. It had stopped just short of town, turned away by the thick forest that had once covered the ridge where Marcus now fought to grow trees, the same forest the logging company had clear-cut a year later. Marcus had been 15 then, old enough to understand what he was seeing. The fire had raged for 3 days, an orange monster devouring thousands of acres. But when it reached the forested ridge above Millfield, it had slowed. The thick canopy had trapped moisture. The deep root systems had held the soil together, creating natural fire breaks. The forest had saved the town. And then they'd cut it down for profit. "Why are you really doing this?" Sarah asked him one evening, finding him on the porch studying forestry manuals by lamplight. Marcus looked up at the ridge, where hundreds of small trees struggled against the wind. In the dying light, they looked like an army of children, too small for the battle they faced. "Because fires don't follow schedules," he said quietly, "and trees take 40 years to grow." Sarah followed his gaze. "You think there'll be another fire?" "I think there's always another fire. The question is whether we'll be ready for it." Year 3 brought the first signs of hope. The trees that had survived were growing faster now, their root systems finding pockets of better soil. Marcus had learned to read the land, planting different species in different microclimates. Pine trees on the windward slopes, hardwoods in the protected valleys, shrubs and ground cover to prevent erosion. He wasn't just planting trees anymore. He was engineering an ecosystem. Year 5, and people stopped calling it a folly. The ridge was green again. Not lush, not yet, but unmistakably alive. Birds returned first, then small mammals. The soil, held in place by root systems, began to build depth and richness. Property values in the valley started to rise. Maybe you knew something. We didn't, Tom Patterson admitted, watching Marcus plant another section of the hillside. Maybe I just remembered something you forgot, Marcus replied, not unkindly. Year 10. The trees were head-high now, forming the beginnings of a real forest. Marcus had added hiking trails, turning his property into an informal nature preserve. Families came on weekends to walk among the young trees and enjoy the view of Millfield below. The hardware store was thriving too. People drove from neighboring towns to shop at the business owned by the Tree Man, a nickname that had evolved from mockery to affection. But Marcus wasn't finished. Every spare dollar went back into the forest. More trees, better irrigation, fire-resistant native species. He studied wildfire behavior, consulting with forestry experts from the state university, because he knew what was coming. Climate change was making fires bigger, hotter, more frequent. The mountains around Millfield were experiencing drought cycles that turned entire regions into tinderboxes. It wasn't a matter of if another fire would threaten the town. It was a matter of when. Year 20. The forest was magnificent now, tall enough to cast real shade, dense enough to feel like a cathedral when you walked through it. The trees Marcus had planted as saplings were now 30 feet tall, their canopies interweaving to create the kind of microclimate that could slow a fire or turn it aside. New trees had sprouted on their own, seeds carried by wind and wildlife. The forest was expanding beyond the boundaries of Marcus's property, claiming adjacent lands that had been abandoned by other owners. It's beautiful, Sarah said, walking with him through the heart of his creation. They were in their 60s. Now, their hair silver, their steps slightly slower, but the forest around them was vibrant with life. It's not about beautiful, Marcus said, though he smiled as he said it. It's about ready. Year 30, Marcus began teaching. Not formally, he wasn't a certified forester or fire safety expert, but people came to him anyway. Other communities facing similar challenges, environmental groups interested in reforestation, college students writing papers on sustainable land management. He showed them what one person could accomplish with patience and determination, how understanding the land was more important than fighting it, how thinking in decades instead of seasons could solve problems that seemed impossible. The secret, he would tell them, standing in the shade of trees he'd planted 3 decades earlier, isn't knowing when disaster will strike. It's being prepared before it gets here. Year 35, the drought came. 2 years of minimal rainfall turned the entire region into a powder keg. Forests that had stood for centuries became brittle and brown. Ranchers watched their pastures turn to dust. The state issued fire restrictions that banned everything from campfires to welding. Marcus watched the weather reports with growing concern. The conditions were perfect for a catastrophic wildfire. All it would take was one spark of lightning strike, a down power line, a carelessly discarded cigarette. He spent that summer preparing, installing additional irrigation systems in key areas of his forest, creating fire breaks along the perimeter, coordinating with county emergency services to ensure they understood the forest's role in protecting the town. You really think it's coming? Sarah asked, watching him work with an intensity she hadn't seen in years. Marcus pointed to the mountains, where heat shimmer made the distant peaks dance like mirages. Look at those hills, Sarah. They're begging to burn. Year 40, the fire started on a Tuesday. Lightning strike in the National Forest, 15 miles north of Millfield. By Wednesday, it had consumed 5,000 acres. By Thursday, it was racing toward populated areas with the speed and fury of a living thing. The evacuation order came Friday morning, but Marcus Thorne didn't evacuate. He stood on his ridge, surrounded by for decades of growth, and prepared to see if his life's work would be enough. The fire moved like a predator. Marcus had seen wildfires before, but never one like this. It didn't follow the predictable patterns of normal blazes spreading steadily uphill, slowing in valleys, pausing at natural barriers. This fire leaped. It ran. It seemed to hunt. From his position on the ridge, Marcus could see the orange glow advancing through the mountains. Like a sunset in the wrong direction, the air tasted of smoke and fear. Behind him, Millfield was emptying as residents loaded. Cars and trucks with whatever they could carry. Sarah had left that morning with their daughter's family, heading east to the relative safety of Billings. She'd begged Marcus to come with them. "The forest will survive without you watching it," she'd said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Maybe," Marcus had replied, checking his equipment one last time, "but I've spent 40 years preparing for this day. I need to see if I got it right now." Alone except for Scout the golden retriever, who'd refused to leave his side, Marcus activated the irrigation systems he'd installed throughout the forest. Sprinklers emerged from hidden positions, sending arcs of precious water across the tree canopy. It wouldn't stop a major fire, but it might slow one down. He'd spent the last 5 years studying fire behavior with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He knew that forests could serve as fire breaks if they were properly managed. Dense canopies trapped moisture and cooled the air. Deep root systems prevented the kind of erosion that turned hillsides into wind tunnels. Properly spaced trees could fragment a fire front, breaking it into smaller, more manageable blazes. But theory was about to meet reality. By noon Friday, the evacuation was complete. Millfield sat empty except for emergency personnel and one stubborn hardware store owner who'd refused to leave his trees. The fire chief, Ray Morrison, Betty's son, made one last attempt to convince Marcus to evacuate. "It's not worth dying for," Ray said, his voice muffled by the respirator he wore against the thickening smoke. Marcus looked at the forest around them, thousands of trees reaching toward a sky that grew darker by the hour. 40 years ago, "Ray, this ridge saved your grandmother's house, saved the whole town. The forest that did that is gone now, cut down for lumber. This forest is what I built to replace it. And if it doesn't work, then at least we'll know." Marcus shouldered his backpack, filled with emergency supplies and monitoring equipment. "But I think it will work. These trees have been preparing for this their whole lives." Ray left, shaking his head but understanding. Everyone in Millfield knew Marcus Thorne's story. The crazy man who'd planted trees on worthless land had become something of a local legend. If anyone had earned the right to stay and watch his life's work face its ultimate test, it was him. The fire reached the outer edge of Marcus's property at 3 p.m. He watched it crest the ridge to the north, a wall of orange and red that seemed to stretch from earth to heaven. The heat was visible waves of distortion that made the air shimmer and dance. The sound was worse than the sight, a roar like a freight train, mixed with the screams of dying trees. Scout whined and pressed closer to Marcus's legs. The dog's instincts were right. Every living thing should be running from what was coming. But Marcus held his ground. The fire hit the northern edge of his forest like a wave hitting a breakwater. And something remarkable happened. It slowed, not stopped. Wildfires of this magnitude don't stop for anything. But the wall of flame that had been racing across the barren mountainside at 30 miles per hour suddenly dropped to 15, then 10. The thick canopy of Marcus's forest was creating its own weather. The temperature dropped several degrees. As the fire moved under the trees, humidity increased. The wind patterns changed, becoming more chaotic and less predictable. Marcus moved through his forest like a general observing a battle, recording wind speeds, temperature readings, and the fire's behavior at different elevations. This wasn't just about saving Millfield anymore. It was about proving that intelligent forest management could protect communities from increasingly dangerous wildfires. The fire reached the heart of his property at 5 p.m. Here, where the trees were oldest and most densely planted, the fire's behavior changed completely. Instead of the crown fire that had been leaping from treetop to treetop, consuming everything in its path, the blaze dropped to the ground level. It became a surface fire, burning underbrush and fallen leaves, but leaving the mature trees largely untouched. Marcus watched in fascination as his forest did exactly what he'd designed it to do. The deep irrigation he'd installed over the years had created moisture levels that made the larger trees nearly fire-resistant. The careful spacing between different species had prevented the fire from building the momentum it needed to jump back into the canopy. The natural fire breaks he'd created by varying tree density were fragmenting the fire front, forcing it to slow down and change direction. But the real test was still coming. At 7 p.m., the fire reached the southern edge of his property, the ridge directly above Millfield. This was the moment Marcus had been preparing for since 1954, the same geographical position where the original forest had stopped the fire of 1973. If his trees could hold here, they would save the town. If they couldn't, Marcus positioned himself on a rocky outcrop that gave him a clear view of both the approaching fire and the town below. Millfield looked like a ghost town in the smoky twilight, its empty streets and abandoned buildings waiting to learn their fate. The fire hit the ridge at 8:15 p.m. For 30 minutes, it looked like the forest might fail. The fire had regained intensity as it climbed the steep slope, feeding on the wind patterns created by the valley below. Flames reached into the lower branches of the trees Marcus had planted 40 years earlier, the air filled with sparks and burning debris. Scout barked in terror as embers rained down around them. Marcus watched his life's work burn and wondered if he'd been wrong about everything. But then, as the sun set behind the smoke-filled sky, the fire began to die. Not extinguished. Wildfires don't simply go out, but contained, controlled, reduced to the kind of surface burn that forests had evolved to survive. The trees Marcus had planted held their ground. The irrigation systems he'd installed kept them moist enough to resist ignition. The fire breaks he'd created prevented the blaze from building back into a crown fire. Most importantly, the forest created a wall of cooler, more humid air that turned the fire away from Millfield. Instead of racing downhill toward the town, the blaze moved laterally along the ridge, following the path of least resistance away from populated areas. Marcus stood among his trees as the fire moved past, feeling the heat on his face, but knowing that the worst was over. His forest had worked. Millfield was safe. At 10 p.m., his satellite phone rang. Sarah's voice, crackling with static and emotion. "Marcus, are you all right? The news is saying the fire missed the town." "It didn't miss," Marcus said, looking at the scattered flames still burning among his trees. "It was stopped." Dawn broke, gray and smoky over a transformed landscape. Marcus walked through his forest as the sun rose, Scout padding quietly beside him. The air still tasted of smoke and ash, but the immediate danger had passed. Scattered spot fires still burned among the underbrush, but they were the kind of low-intensity burns that forests needed to regenerate. His trees had survived. Not all of them. He'd lost perhaps 10%, mostly younger plantings on the exposed northern slope. But the mature forest, the heart of what he'd built over for decades, stood intact, scorched in places, but alive. As Marcus emerged from the forest onto the access road that led back to town, he found himself facing an unexpected sight. A convoy of vehicles stretching as far as he could see. Fire trucks, news vans, government cars with official plates, and behind them, a stream of civilian vehicles, residents returning to discover what remained of their homes. The first person to reach him was Ray Morrison, the fire chief, still wearing the same gear he'd had on when he'd tried to convince Marcus to evacuate. "Jesus Christ, Marcus," Ray said, pulling off his helmet. "You actually did it." "Did what?" "Saved the town. The fire modeling guys from the state are saying that without your forest, the blaze would have hit Millfield with enough intensity to level half the buildings." Marcus looked past Ray toward the town nestled in the valley below. From this distance, it looked exactly as it had the day before, peaceful, undamaged, whole. "The trees did their job," he said quietly. But Ray wasn't finished. "There's more. The fire's still burning on the other side of the ridge, but it's moving away from populated areas. Your forest didn't just stop it redirected it toward areas where it can burn safely." Over the next hour, Marcus found himself at the center of a controlled chaos he'd never expected. Fire safety experts wanting to document exactly how his forest had performed, news reporters asking for interviews, government officials taking soil samples and measuring tree spacing. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a wildfire specialist from the University of Montana, was particularly interested in the irrigation systems Marcus had installed. "This is remarkable," she said, examining the sprinkler heads that were still misting water over the surviving trees. You created a microclimate that fundamentally changed the fire's behavior. The moisture content you maintained in the canopy was enough to prevent crown ignition even under extreme conditions. I had good teachers, Marcus said, thinking of the forestry manuals he'd studied for decades, and 40 years to get it right. Dr. Rodriguez looked around at the forest that had held back a monster. Mr. Thorne, what you've accomplished here, it's going to change how we think about community fire protection. Would you be willing to work with our research team? Marcus was about to answer when another vehicle arrived, a battered pickup truck that he recognized immediately. Sarah climbed out, followed by their daughter Jennifer and her family. Sarah ran toward him with tears streaming down her face, not caring about the cameras or the crowd of officials. "You stubborn, wonderful fool," she sobbed, throwing her arms around him. "I thought I'd lost you." Marcus held his wife, breathing in the scent of her hair beneath the smell of smoke that seemed to cling to everything. Over her shoulder, he could see their granddaughters 8 and 10 years old staring wide-eyed at the forest that had become the center of so much attention. "Grandpa," the older girl asked, "did your trees really save the whole town?" Marcus knelt down to her level, his knees protesting after the long night. "The trees did what trees do, sweetheart. They grew where they were planted and did their job when the time came. But why did you plant them in the first place?" It was the question everyone was asking now. News reporters, government officials, fire safety experts, all of them wanted to understand what had motivated a hardware store owner to spend 40 years and most of his savings creating a forest on land that everyone said was worthless. Marcus looked at his granddaughter's expectant face, then at the forest rising behind him, then at the town spread out in the valley below, a community of 2,000 souls who had awakened that morning to discover their homes were still standing because someone had to. He said simply that afternoon, as the immediate crisis passed and the various officials began to disperse, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Tom Patterson, now in his 80s and walking with a cane, made his way slowly up the access road to where Marcus was conducting his own damage assessment of the forest. 47 years, Tom said without preamble. "What? 47 years I've lived in Millfield, seen droughts and floods and that tornado in '89, but I never saw anything like what happened here last night." Tom leaned heavily on his cane, studying the trees that surrounded them. Many bore scorch marks, some had lost branches, but they stood. "I owe you an apology, Marcus. We all do. Called you crazy for so long. I started to believe it myself." "You weren't wrong to be skeptical," Marcus said. "It was a crazy idea. Still is, in a lot of ways. Crazy like a fox, maybe." Tom pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "This came for you this morning. Express delivery to the hardware store. But since you weren't there." Marcus opened the envelope and found official letterhead from the State Forestry Department. The letter was brief but stunning. The state wanted to purchase development rights to his property, ensuring it would remain forested in perpetuity. The offer was for more money than Marcus had ever dreamed of having. "They want to turn it into a model for other communities," Tom explained. "Use what you built here to teach other towns how to protect themselves." Marcus read the letter twice, then handed it to Sarah, who had joined them. "What will you tell them?" she asked. Marcus looked around at the forest he'd spent his adult lifetime creating. The trees he'd planted as saplings were now mature giants. The ecosystem he'd engineered was providing habitat for wildlife, preventing erosion, and had just proven it could save human lives. But it wasn't finished. There were still bare patches that needed replanting, areas where the spacing could be improved, new irrigation zones that would make the forest even more fire-resistant. "I'll tell them yes," he said finally, "but with conditions, such as the forest stays working forest, not a museum, not a park, a living system that gets better every year." Marcus smiled, thinking of projects he'd been planning for years but hadn't had the resources to implement. "And I want to help them build more forests like this one, other towns, other ridges. 40 years from now, when the next big fire comes, I want there to be forests ready for it." That evening, as the celebration wound down and the visitors departed, Marcus walked one last time through the heart of his forest with Sarah by his side. They followed the same path they'd walked together for 50 years, but everything around them had changed. Where once there had been barren hillside, now towering trees created a cathedral of green. Where once there had been only hope, now there was proof. Any regrets? Sarah asked, echoing the question she'd posed on the night of the Great Fire. Marcus stopped beside the oak tree he'd planted on his first day, now a giant that would outlive him by centuries. In the fading light, he could see the town below, safe in the shadow of the forest he'd built to protect it. Only one, he said. What's that? Marcus smiled, thinking of all the communities still vulnerable to wildfire, all the barren hillsides that could become forests, all the young people like Amy who were just beginning to understand what patience and persistence could accomplish. That I can't live another 50 years to see what comes next. Marcus Thorne wasn't supposed to succeed. One man, worthless land, a 40-year timeline that seemed insane to everyone watching. The experts said trees wouldn't grow on that ridge. The neighbors called it Thorne's folly. Even the bank loan officer questioned his sanity. But Marcus Thorne understood something that changed everything. Some protection can't be bought. It has to be grown. He didn't have government funding. He didn't have corporate backing. He didn't have advanced degrees in forestry or fire science. What he had was vision. The ability to see not what was, but what could be. The willingness to plant trees that wouldn't provide protection for decades. The faith that patience and persistence could accomplish what seemed impossible. And when the fire came roaring down from the mountains, with the power to destroy an entire town, his forest stood in its way. This is why we tell these stories at Still Standing Souls. Because in a world that demands instant results, we need reminders that the most important work takes time. That the difference between communities that survive disasters and communities that don't often comes down to someone who planted trees they'd never see fully grown. That individual action, sustained over decades, can literally save lives. What are you planting today that will protect tomorrow? Not just trees though, if you're in a fire-prone area. Maybe trees are exactly what you should be planting. But what long-term thinking are you investing in? What seemingly impossible project are you willing to start even though you won't live to see it finished? What protection are you growing for people you'll never meet? Marcus Thorne proved that one person with enough patience and stubbornness can stand between disaster and community. That forests don't happen by accident, they happen because someone decides to plant the first tree. That hope isn't just an emotion, it's a strategy that works if you're willing to measure results in decades instead of quarters. Subscribe to Still Standing Souls and join a community that celebrates the long view, the patient work, the quiet heroes who plant trees in the faith that someone, someday, will need their shade. Because the world needs more people like Marcus Thorne. People who look at barren hillsides and see forests. People who understand that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. Still Standing Souls, where impossible grows one tree at a time.